Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of House Resolution 418. This is a bipartisan resolution offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, calling on the government of Burma to end its persecution of the Rohingya Muslims and respect the human rights of all ethnic and religious minority groups within Burma. The Rohingya Muslims are one of the most persecuted minority groups in the world. According to Burma's 1982 citizenship law, the Rohingya are prohibited from holding Burmese citizenship even though they have lived in Burma for generations after generations. For over 3 decades, the government of Burma has systematically denied the Rohingya even the most basic of human rights while subjecting them to unspeakable abuses. Since 2012, 140,000 Rohingya and other Muslims in Burma have been displaced by violence, with hundreds killed. The United States must prioritize the protection of human rights in its engagement with Burma. I urge the State Department to take off the rose-colored glasses and recognize that progress on human rights in Burma is indeed limited. Now is the time for the State Department to bring additional leverage to bear, and this resolution will help us do that.
In February, the Burmese government expelled Doctors Without Borders, and since then, deaths due to preventable complications during pregnancy have occurred on an almost daily basis in Rohingya camps, where pregnant women make up a quarter of the group's emergency referrals. Mr. Speaker, as the government of Burma transitions from decades-long military rule to a civilian government, it is important to hold it accountable for persistent human rights abuses. The killings, arbitrary detentions, and destruction of homes have caused 140,000 people to be internally displaced, and hundreds of thousands have been forced to flee to neighboring countries, including Thailand, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. If Burma truly seeks to rejoin the international community, the manner in which it treats its own people will be a key marker of the government's sincerity. Burma must abide by human rights principles of equality and human dignity, and this resolution calls upon the Burmese government to do just that.
Some 140,000 displaced Rohingya have been forced to live in camps described as open-air prisons. Doctors Without Borders was forced out by the Burmese government, and since then nearly 150 Rohingya have died of medically related causes. This particular photo illustrates the Doctors Without Borders clinic. It's shuttered. They're gone. The people are not getting the medical care that they're entitled to, and people are literally dying as a result of this. Further, mob violence has made a number of other international NGOs evacuate Burma for fear and being essentially excluded by the government, and they were doing good work for people who really needed it, were in dire straits. The Burmese government has taken few, if any, steps to forge a peaceful, harmonious, and prosperous future for the Rakhine State. It is complicit in extrajudicial killings, rape, arbitrary detention, torture, deaths in detention, and for denial of due process and fair trial rights for the Rohingya. As these horribly repressed people who are afforded no identity by the Burmese government have been forced into camps, the Burmese government has confiscated their land, their homes, and property for redistribution to the Buddhist Rakhine majority. A recent report by a group united to end genocide found that nowhere else in the world are there more precursors to genocide, signs that genocide may well happen, than in Burma right now.
The government of Burma remains apathetic to the plight of the Rohingya population and has failed to properly investigate the major events of anti-Rohingya violence. Now let me be clear. The situation is dire and rapidly deteriorating. Multiple recognized independent human rights NGOs, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Burma, have stated that the series of actions directed at the Rohingyas in Burma could amount to crimes against humanity. Further, a recent report by the U.S. NGO United to End Genocide states that nowhere in the world are there more precursors to genocide than in Burma right now. In the past few weeks, we have all taken time to remember and commemorate the victims of the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and the genocide in Rwanda. We saw the same disturbing signs in other moments of history, and we know what the consequences are of not paying attention. Showing support for this bill is one step that we can take today toward fulfilling the solemn pledge of never again.
It's time for the United States to send a clear and strong message to the government of Burma that we will not tolerate the persecution of religious and ethnic minorities, and that it must abide by human rights principles of equality and dignity if it is to rejoin the international community.
But the reality is that the recent events here are deeply, deeply troubling to anyone who is watching. As I indicated, 48 Rohingya were murdered, aid workers trying to care for thousands of displaced have been attacked in the country, Doctors Without Borders kicked out of Burma. This resolution calls on the government of Burma to immediately recognize the Rohingya as an ethnic minority and to grant them citizenship, a step that is long overdue, as Mr. McGovern pointed out. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan resolution. Let's all send a message that the current state of human rights in Burma is unacceptable. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 418 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.